Good afternoon everyone and welcome to an interactive session on AGNIi enabling technology commercialization. I am Pooja Monga from the AGNIi team and we have with us Professor K. Vijayaraghavan, who is the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India. The PSA works with all arms of the government in areas of science and technology. Sir is the chairperson of PMSTIAC, which is the Prime Minister's Science, Technology, Innovation and Advisory Council. He's also been the Secretary of DBT for 5 years and he's been awarded the Padma Shri. Sir, we often receive many questions on what is AGNIi, what is the role of the Principal Scientific Advisor in AGNIi, and what is the vision of AGNIi. And since it's a program under the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor, what better way of addressing these questions than to hear it from the PSA himself. So, we'll jump into the session here and we'd love to hear from you how your journey has been in the science and research community and your thoughts on the program.
Well, thank you very much, Pooja. And rather than recount my personal history in the science and technology sphere, let me use that period to tell you how science and technology has changed enormously in India. Science and technology, soon after independence, went through a phase where at the basic science level, we were substantially individual driven rather than institution driven. And at the applied science, our goal was indigenization, doing things on our own over here. What happened soon afterwards was the creation of a huge number of institutions in engineering, in medicine, in sciences, and also the growth of our national laboratory system, the CSIR, the Indian Agricultural Research Institute, the Indian Council for Medical Research and so on. So science moved from being a nationalistic quest for indigenization and a quest for individual success to something which became more institutionalized and has specific kinds of deliverables over there. That required more investment in science and that grew. That required a greater partnership with industry. And because of the growth of the public sector, that partnership also grew. And all the great institutions we see today, the space agency, the atomic energy, the defense, our agricultural system, our health system, grew from public investment in science and technology. So in that phase, those two phases, the early phase and the middle phase, science and technology has done enormously well for the country, and we must constantly appreciate that. The foundations have built great institutions which have taken hundreds of millions of Indians out of poverty, given us better health, food, energy security, and so on. But we must keep in mind what's happened over the last couple of decades, and that is a dramatically changing world. In that changing world, the kind of structures we had over the last couple of decades before are not fit for business now, in the sense that in addition to that, we need to be globally and nationally competitive. Because the demands are different, the way science and technology has changed is dramatically different. With that in mind, the interactions with industry amongst our scientists and the demands by industry have started changing, and that started again about 10 or 15 years ago. Over the last 5 years, this resulted in a concerted effort to push the interaction end by substantially investing in the startup ecosystem. That has resulted in many quality startups across different sectors. And now our challenge is to further strengthen that ecosystem, but also take these startups to commercialization. And that's where AGNIi comes in.
Mm-hmm. So, sir, if you could tell us a little bit more about the PMSTIAC and how AGNIi is one of the missions in it, that would be great.
So the Prime Minister's Science, Technology and Innovation Advisory Council was set up last year, and this really consolidated the multiple advisory systems which used to be there. There was a Science Advisory Council to the Cabinet, a Science Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, a Knowledge Commission, an Innovation Commission, and all this was put together in a relatively small and nimble organization, a nimble committee, council, in which there are members from academia, from industry, And all the science secretaries are permanent invitees, and other secretaries of the Government of India come in. And the purpose of this advisory council is really twofold. One, it scans the landscape and decides what is the best direction to take for different sectors and gives that advice to the government. But it also formulates missions which require synergy, collaboration, the working together, and which are also ambitious, which the country needs. And it works as the program management unit, as it were, in these synergistic projects. So we've had multiple discussions. Before the elections, we met for the 4 months before, when we were constituted, once every month, and we formulated many missions. And now after the elections, we've started meeting again. So the kinds of missions we're taking up range from artificial intelligence, quantum computing, bioscience for human health, which will be a major genomics mission for human health, a biodiversity mission, a mission on electric mobility, another one on looking at the way we can take our science and technology to commercialization, which is AGNIi, accelerating growth for our new India innovations, and a major one on translating all of scientific literature which is used in our schools and colleges, so that every student can read and understand both in English and in their native language. So a bilingual availability of quality science material, both written as well as videos and so on and so forth. So these are the kinds of missions we're taking up. And now we have formed groups which the ministries will develop and formulate and be the funding for the missions. But our office will work with them so that they're enabled to work across ministries, departments, states, academia, industry to implement these missions.
Sure. Thank you, sir, for that information. And I think a lot of times we receive this question, and it would be great to know from you, how did you envision AGNIi? What is the role of AGNIi in the innovation ecosystem, and how is the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor involved in this process of bringing about that change?
Well, that's I think is the fundamental core question. And AGNIi, I should say, the idea came up over a 3-year period of discussion. Mm-hmm. And what we were seeing was, at one hand, an enormous increase in our academic system, a desire to convert knowledge and discovery to application. Mm-hmm. That paralleled an increase in our startup ecosystem. Mm-hmm. So that's one component.
Right.
The other component is our industry. Mm-hmm. And our industry has grown substantially, is more and more ambitious. Mm-hmm. Now these two components, 1A and 1B, are our academia and our startup ecosystem, and our industry. Even though they both have ambitions, there seems to be a relatively poor connect with each other. And there's good reason for that. One shouldn't just bemoan the absence of connection. And that's because our startup ecosystem and our academia are competing for commercialization with global enterprises which have enormous investment and enormously advanced ecosystems. Our ecosystems need to grow. Right. Similarly, our industry, even when they're doing well, have capital, but they may not have risk capital compared to the way big industries, multinationals may have. So they're unable to invest in cutting-edge R&D for commercialization in the way which is needed. AGNIi tries to bridge this gap, not the investment gap, but looking at successful startups, successful ideas which are near commercialization. They are in technology readiness levels 6 and beyond, for example, and take them by doing financial and market due diligence to see whether they can be linked to commercialization to companies. And conversely, look at companies and ask, what do they need? Are there technologies around in the ecosystem which can link them to their requirements?
Sure. So, sir, like you've mentioned right now that the TRL level is important, we're doing the matchmaking. So who would you suggest should apply to AGNIi? Who are the innovators and what stage should they be at to be applying to AGNIi?
So typically, this depends on the sector, right? So supposing you are in the hard manufacturing sector or sectors which require machining, getting things ready, then it's relatively easy to say that you must have prototyped and be ready to go to market. Struggling to do that, and you're ready to convey it to someone who's willing to either invest or partner on a large scale, that you're ready and you can go.
Right.
There are other technologies which are, for example, related more to IT, linked to high-end design, where a relatively smaller investment by you, and also a situation where you're a small group of people can have a path-breaking idea which can actually jump across multiple TRL levels and go to commercialization in a big way. And there are, of course, other things in between. So it really depends where you are, but the bottom line is that, are you ready for commercialization? Don't worry if you think that you are ready for commercialization and you come to us and we tell you, look, we need to go a little more before you come back to us. We will also point you to other ventures in our ecosystem which address those kinds of earlier stage issues.
Great. So, sir, just to understand better, according to you, what are the services that AGNIi is providing to all the stakeholders in the ecosystem?
Well, there are an expectation when we talk about services that AGNIi will actually give you funds to go across this valley. Now, that's not AGNIi's role. AGNIi is not a funding organization. So that's one thing to be clear. In terms of, if you ask what are AGNIi's services, we have to start by saying what it's not.
Yes.
But that said, I think it actually provides something even more valuable. It provides a certain quality of hand-holding, which is really necessary for you to make it big.
Right.
So we come with a awareness and a scoping of our ecosystem. So we know what industry wants. Right? And that we bring to you not only from our partnerships with academia and with industry directly, but also being very closely associated. AGNIi is housed at Invest India. And Invest India is an extraordinary organization whose core purpose is to attract investment to India. But in doing so, it's got two very important verticals inside. One is a vertical for every sector. Right? So it knows what that sector's the economics are, the finances, the technology, and the growth potential. And second, it's connected to every state. And so it knows what's possible in every state. And thirdly, of course, it's connected internationally. So this connection allows us to help you in your commercialization by saying, look, here's a product you have. It may not suit a market in a particular location, but there's something else which can partner with you, a company, and we can take you over there. So we give you market access to innovators. We can showcase your technology, and we do a demand-driven scouting with industry so that your product can go to industry. And we link academia and industry so that if you're not at the later stages, you can rapidly join.
Right. Thank you, sir, for showcasing what the services of AGNIi are. I'd like to now spend some time on the innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem of India. Since we rank so high in the innovation index now, we'd love to learn from you and hear from you the various organizations that are working in this space, and how is AGNIi complementing their services and at the same time different from what they are doing currently?
The very important point we must keep in mind is different organizations in our ecosystem play different roles along the line, as it were, from early stage to commercialization. Even though I must say that's not a line. I like to use the metaphor that it's more like a jalebi, because certain kinds of technologies go very rapidly, others go slowly, others feed back. So there's a feedback system. And this feedback system is actually the source of the confusion sometimes in people's minds. At both ends, both at the end of the entrepreneur and at the end of those who are trying to help the entrepreneur. Which organization do you go to? Right? Do you go to someone who's funding your ignition idea? And for example, in biotechnology, the Biotechnology Industry Research Assistance Council, BIRAC, will fund very early ideas. and the Department of Science and Technology similarly will support such early ideas. So if you have an early idea, even if you think it's ready for commercialization, a test run with our ministries such as the Department of Biotechnology, Department of Science and Technology, and their funding programs would be the place to go. About 2 years ago, the Atal Innovation Mission was created, and that is a new kid on the block and which has done extraordinarily well. And it's got a range of programs. You must visit their website. They have tinkering labs in schools, which is not the topic of our discussion today, but they have incubators. They have incubator support for the older ones, so they're enhancing the incubator capacity. New incubators. They have innovation challenges, and now they're getting into incubators in the rural area. So if you are into incubators and early stage entrepreneurship, the Atal Innovation Mission and the existing incubator system of the Department of Science and Technology and Biotechnology are where you can go to. In addition to that, many institutions, exemplary, are IIT, Bombay, Delhi and Madras, but several others have started tech parks, and these are extraordinarily vibrant, and they have got businesses started which attract investment from the private sector substantially, and that's taken off really extremely well. The government aided support has been very valuable for more expensive ventures which take a longer haul like biotechnology, but in the Internet of Things, the cyber physical systems and IT, the engineering ecosystem has taken off brilliantly. So I would go to those kinds for the relatively early stages. Now, once you've passed the early stage and you're ready to, go a little more on your own, you would go to private venture capital, which is complicated sometimes it's easy. If you are an e-commerce person and you've convinced someone, you can get a lot of investment. But if you're, more of a brick and mortar kind of startup, it can be tougher because the returns are more longer term. Startup India is an extraordinary location for those kinds. They will facilitate you. They will deal with process facilitation, patent filing, for tax exemption, setting up of your business and so on, support on regulatory and policy issues, certificates and licenses, and also capacity building. So that's a very large portfolio which they manage really well, and you should go to them. They are not a funding agency per se, but the other funding agencies are what I told you about. AGNIi is sort of in between in the sense it sucks in inputs from both of these kinds of entrepreneurship and funnels it into industry when you go into commercialization.
So I hope that you're learning as much as we are. While we've learned about AGNIi and its services, we've also learned about PMSTAG, Atal Innovation Mission, DST, DBT funding, and Startup India. And there's much more to learn right after this. So while we've touched upon these topics, I think it would be great to know from Sir about a few examples of successful commercializations within India, and then we move on to the international ecosystem to see how we can bring about our learnings from there to expand the ecosystem here.
Well, what's absolutely fascinating is how from a period of about 5 years ago, when the startup ecosystem was being amplified, you saw an extraordinary skepticism early on. People were of the view, you have to compete globally, and moreover, if you support these kinds of ventures, typically people will get addicted to support and they'll be sort of permanently startups. You're not going to get them scale up. Now, that myth was broken by many e-commerce related successes. And then the argument came, but these are all e-commerce kinds of successes. These are not in the real world. But the e-commerce kind of successes had certain kinds of components to it. For example, edutech, there have been successes, and there have been huge increases. And those have provided extraordinary value. But what's happened is rather remarkable. If you look at areas such as, in biotech, in core biotech, where you are going from molecular modeling to design a potential cancer drug, or trying to see where it docks into a molecule and can treat certain kinds of cancers. Taking that design onto animal testing, taking that potential candidate drug into the next stage and getting global funding for that. There's a company I know which has done extraordinarily well. And there you could say, attracting hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. That you could say, oh, you lucked out, you bought a lottery ticket, which you won, but that company has done it again, right? They've got another investment for another molecule.
Right.
So this shows there is a core knowledge-dependent capacity in our ecosystem. There are several other companies, some of them older, which have similarly done well, so it's not a one-off. So in very hard knowledge-dependent experimental connect to technology, some Indian companies have started doing well. What's the problem in this space? They do face a problem, and we must address that soon. The problem comes after this early success. There is an extraordinary circling of capital to spot these companies and take them to other sites elsewhere in the world. Our ecosystems must be attractive both in terms of investment and in terms of actual scaling to allow them to build up over here. That's something we're putting our effort now, but that's a very important point to address. This similar situation is there in a completely different area. Look at the manufacturing of semiconductors. That's an area which many Indians say that we should have invested decades ago. We didn't, and we've lost that race. But something very interesting has happened very recently, that semiconductor fabrication has hinged substantially on quality design. And quality design means extraordinarily talented and well-trained engineers who can design circuits and then get them manufactured in companies all over the world. And then systems are integrated and those then function. So in terms of circuit design, system integration, system functioning, Indians are present in top companies all over the world, and when those companies are in India, Indian designers are present over there. But that's also led to Indian entrepreneurs in this area who again, like the example I told you in biotech, have done really well and again are in the danger of being bought out. So our next phase must be that while these people are doing really well, they shouldn't, have options only outside, there should be options here. A third example, let me give you, well, there are two more, but one is about seaweed, right? Now, there was a company which grew out of a bunch of students who tried to enter a competition in IIT Madras. They then decided to take seaweed and convert it to biofuels. But on the way, they found that they could make value-added products which are really valuable for industry. And now they've got extraordinary international investment to scale up. Their scaling up is limited not just by capital availability, but by the way our biodiversity laws are. They, have rather firm approaches, no matter how non-damaging or damaging to the environment particular technologies are. So these people now are forced to go elsewhere for large-scale cultivation of seaweed to manufacture. So some of our laws for drug discovery and for dealing with medicinal plants as well as value from medicinal plants need to be changed. They are not difficult to change in a manner which don't damage the environment, and that's something which is going. Finally, if you look at a very, very competitive area, such as emerging antibiotic resistance, you would think that that's an area where only big investment internationally and big companies can do well. But again, because of global competitions and Indian science agencies pushing those competitions, Indian companies have done well. So it is very, very impressive to see talented people coming up in our ecosystem and taking on really complex challenges which require deep science. And now our ecosystem from the academic end needs to formulate more futuristic questions for entrepreneurship, as well as industry needs to have the capacity to absorb and invest in.
So I think these are very interesting examples to learn from. A follow-up question to the issues that you addressed here is like, you gave us the jalebi example, how the journey of every innovator is different based on which sector you're focusing on, based on how much R&D is required. We speak to many innovators, who tell us that we've been building up products for very long, but it's taking, even longer to commercialize because this duration between a prototype and the final product is maybe 2 to 3 years. So, what kind of inputs would you like to give to the different types of innovators? One could be, e-commerce platforms like you addressed versus someone who has a huge R&D. And the same inputs could be utilized for different types of innovators, whether you're in an academic institution or research lab, which is spending a lot of time in R&D, versus a startup who has a business model ready. What kind of inputs can we give to such innovators?
Well, this is the critical challenge for inventors and entrepreneurship. How do they go forward? How do they go forward in a difficult period?
Right.
No matter what you do in life, your early stage is fraught with these kinds of problems. Mm-hmm. And particularly in being an entrepreneur and being an entrepreneur going to commercialization, you're really being thrown at the deep end of the pool, as it were, and you have to find ways out. And that's not necessary today. We can learn two things from systems which have addressed this problem well, and secondly, how are we best positioned to tailor that in our context? Globally, entrepreneurship to commercialization has succeeded for 4 reasons. I'll come to the 4th later, but the 3 crucial internal reasons for the entrepreneurship is a curation of ideas. Mm-hmm. You have certain core capabilities. What is it that you want to go and get involved in? So you need to see a lot of ideas. That system where you're constantly shown multiple ideas needs to be there during your college period, your professional training, and later on. Mm-hmm. Secondly is a mentoring, and that's something which our ecosystem needs to amplify rather substantially.
Right.
You need people who tell you from your technology perspective about what's the best way to solve various kinds of problems. Right. That again is a relatively early stage. Sometimes there are expensive ways, sometimes there are cheaper ways. That's happening really well in some places. It's happening, for example, at this IIT Madras park I told you about. In IIT Delhi, there's another park. Mm-hmm. In some other institutions, it's happening reasonably well. Mm-hmm. And these are not, formal one-on-one mentorships, but the environment is such that you bump into your mentors more frequently. Mm-hmm. So the curation of ideas and the mentoring are 2 very important components. But both these address actually the tip of the iceberg of the entrepreneurial success problem. The real challenge, while money and all of that is important, the real challenge is what I call the requirement for a broker. An honest broker who can take you through your, pothole of today, your road bump of tomorrow, your regulatory problems of day after, in a system which otherwise you as an entrepreneur have to do everything on your own.
Right.
In more developed startup ecosystems, that's done by a core office or a set of people who address this.
Right.
And the 4th component is that the regulatory system is much better oiled for startups to do well, and the procurement system is much better oiled for startups to be part of the procurement system. These 2 aspects have been addressed very well over the last 4 years. That's cleared up much of the pipeline, but I think we're going to see more. So as our size of our environment grows, you're going to see better curation, better mentoring, and better brokering, and more success. But those are really the pitfalls. Getting money in is a question of trust. Mm-hmm. If those who put in money feel that the evaluation is trustworthy, it can happen. IIT Madras, for example, has got a constant turnover of a set of meetings where they get venture capitals, and they have an evaluation, and then the investment takes place. So they trust the IIT Madras ecosystem to evaluate. Mm-hmm. That kind of an ecosystem is doing well at BIRAC, the Biotechnology Innovation Research Assistance Council, with respect to their funding, but now it needs to scale to external funding also. So things are happening.
So I think we've learned more about the domestic innovation ecosystem now. So, we'd like to know more about the international innovation ecosystem. India has R&D, it has skilled labor, it has a booming startup ecosystem and an overall innovation ecosystem. But if you were to quote an example, tell us more about any specific international case from which India can learn, that would be great.
Let's take the kinds of technologies which are used widely in areas such as healthcare or agriculture or defense, and these typically involve both the analysis of large volumes of data or getting sensors taking in inputs from a wide variety of contexts. Then this data is analyzed, distilled, and then is fed back to decision making to a machine or a set of people. So the underlying principle of hugely successful startups today in the knowledge economy is the sensing of the environment, the analysis of the data, and feeding that back. And this can be entirely data-driven or data plus an Internet of Things driven or impact on health or agriculture in very real ways. So this has changed the system across the world. If you look at the Scandinavian countries, Israel, in the US, other parts of Europe, in the UK, for example, this is really bubbling a lot. And Indians and Indian innovations are hugely appreciated, but the volume of quality innovations is still very small. Each of our innovation ecosystems, Bangalore, the Delhi region, the National Capital Region, Pune, Ahmedabad, Hyderabad, each of them is of the size of a European country, right? Bangalore, for example, has a population, I think, same as that of the Netherlands. Right? So there's an enormous opportunity there. And you look at the successes in the ecosystem in Bangalore or Hyderabad, you find they're extraordinary. There are global investors coming in the knowledge economy and coming in there. And they're doing this despite all the messiness which we have, despite all the regulatory hurdles, despite the infrastructure issues. Imagine what would happen if we actually address them.
Right.
So that's the focus now, to look not at individual startups alone and funding them or supporting them and taking them forward, but looking at them as units in a larger cluster which has value. Now let's go back again and look at health, for example, as a cluster issue which needs to be addressed, and consequentially a company which does that well can go elsewhere. Then you're working, let's say, in Pune to address health data and its management, and that is portable to other locations. Look at our huge garbage collections which we have. If we have to clear that up, that requires startups and managing that. So those are the kinds of things which we are pushing, and I think will happen. But there's also, and it's not to say that our water conservation efforts, our waste efforts, our health and our agriculture are the only areas where startups function. Startups will scale big time like in other countries if in addition to these, their technologies are exportable globally. And that is something which our mechanisms for scaling startups should allow an integration into our procurement system in a manner which they can grow to a certain size and become engines of export.
Great. Thank you so much, sir. We really appreciate you taking up the time and addressing all these questions and increasing our knowledge about AGNIi and the innovation ecosystem. We do hope that you enjoyed this session, and we'd like to tell you that our portal is now accepting applications. So if you can log on to www.agni.gov.in, you can apply if you have an innovative solution and would require market access. Do also follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn and Twitter. If you have any questions, do write to us on agni.support@investindia.org.in. And thank you once again, sir, and thank you, sir.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you all. Bye-bye.